I'm glad Johanna gave already this very nice introduction about our institute. Here you see the picture of the building. I'm glad you like the view. I like the view as well, but the rest of the institute looks a bit like a bunker. And I'll explain why this is. This is because we are a research institute as well as a collections institute, and these big walls without windows is not where we are, the researchers and the collection people, but this is where all the collections are. So there's a lot of storerooms there. And what we basically collect and research on is social history, focusing on work, labor relations, and social movements. So if we look at the Global Labor History Research Program at the International Institute of Social History today, I would say we look at work. Why are there worldwide such a big differences in valuation and compensations and working conditions, and how do we see changes over time? We look at labor relations and what explains shifts in labor relations over time. More recently, we've been focusing what exactly is the relation between changes in work and labor relations and social inequalities. And to say just a few words about that, your labor relation can determine your access to certain kind of resources. For example, precarious workers today have far less access to social security than people with a permanent wage job. So this is just one example. If you go back in time and spread yourself across the globe, you will see all kinds of social inequalities, especially inequalities in access to resources linked up with labor relations. And of course, we not just check how this works, we also look at people who try to influence their position, try to change their position either individually or collectively. And this is where our interest in social movements, labor protest comes from. And of course, the project I will be talking about today, the Global Collaboratory on the History of Labor Relations, is very much related to this second bullet point, sorry, about labor relations. So, what was the goal of our project? Oh, sorry. First of all, it's important to stress that we wanted to make a tool. So it's not a research output in itself. We really see it as a tool. We wanted a tool to make an inventory of all types of labor relations worldwide in all their facets and combinations. And we wanted to do so for a number of cross sections in time to get a good overview over time. 1500, 1650, 1800, 1900, and 2000. And you see 1950 between brackets. And this is already the first, let's say, input, example of an input of our participants. In this case, people working on various sub-Saharan African countries. They urged us to also include 1950 because this is for them really the period where not only colonial censuses were first made, but also where a lot changed between 1900 and 2000. So if you really want to include that, you have to have this extra cross-section. So we wanted to have this tool to make this inventory. And we wanted to use this inventory to see where certain types of labor relations rose and declined over time, and we wanted to explain these transitions in a global context. And in the past few years, we also tried to make this link between labor relations and social inequalities I talked about a little bit earlier. But why did we want to make that tool? Why did we want to look at global labor relations? And this already goes back to 1999. The small leaflet written by Marcel van der Linden and Jan Lucassen, the then director of research and the previous director of research, they wrote this leaflet, Prolegomena for a Global Labor History. And in the introduction, they stated that labor history as a field is in crisis. Of course, this is the period after the fall of various communist regimes. It was a crisis in the labor movement. it turned out that Marx's analysis of working class formation was based particularly on England and specifically on Manchester between 1838 and 1867, and was not really concerned with other class elements, so not just wage workers, but people working under self-employment, under indentured labor. Labor history tended not to look at other identities like gender, ethnicity, and what they stated in this small leaflet is that we really should take a global viewpoint. We really should start trying to understand the world of labor worldwide. And then the next step would be to go beyond the white male industrial worker and include other types of work. As soon as you look beyond Europe in the 19th century, you discover other types of work. And basically in Europe, you'd find other types of work as well in that period. And then you need to include and understand all forms of labor. So work for the household, work done for somebody else outside the household, paid, unpaid work, free and unfree labor. And already in that leaflet, you see a kind of rudimentary schedule, you could say. This is not labor relations, but labor process. And here a distinction has been made between autonomous and heteronomous labor processes. Autonomous means that you are, let's say, your own boss. Heteronomous means you work for somebody else. And here the division has been made between unpaid and paid. But you already see household labor, feudal labor, slavery, self-employment, producer cooperatives, indentured labor and free wage labor that was paid. So the whole idea that you have to look at all varieties of labor relations, and that it would be a good idea to have some kind of a schema for that, was already there in 1999. And then we wanted to try to map all these labor relations. And to do that, we had to have a very broad, inclusive definition of work that was already mentioned in that Prolegomena text in 1999. A definition that we borrowed from Chris and Charles Tilly from their work on the capitalism. Work is basically any human effort adding use value to goods and services. And if I would have been in your midst in person, I would have looked at all of you and said, look, if we would have been a group and I would have cooked you a meal tonight, this would have been work, because I work for you to provide you with food. So that's the wide definition we used. And then we made up a definition of labor relations ourselves. So labor relations are often interpreted as industrial relations, so strictly the relation between the workers and the employers, and perhaps also the trade unions. We see it much broader. We define it as for whom one works or with whom one works and under what rules. And these rules can, of course, be very extensive, written down, or implicit. So also this is a very broad definition meant to make it usable and comparable worldwide. And then the project was really born with help of the 𝗵𝗿𝗀𝗃𝗁 that still supports the Collaboratory project. But the project was really born during the first workshop we held in 2007 here in Amsterdam. We would have, in the future, after that, we had many more workshops in several places of the world. So sometimes we were invited by universities or research institutes to come there and have the workshop there. We tried always to include as many colleagues from as many parts of the world as possible, because we wanted to cover all parts of the world. So here you see the first group that started it. Not all of them stayed connected to the project till the very end. Not all of them, I must say, in the end actually delivered a data set, because group disciplines is always, well, sometimes difficult. But when we talk about this taxonomy, this is really where the first steps were taken. All the participants got a brief introduction to the project, and this introduction already had this first diagram. And here, it's not even called types of labor relations yet, but here a first schema has been set up. This is based on the goal of the production. So either the first group is unproductive, children, the elderly, then there are people who produce for the household, and there are redistributive producers. I will come back to the term a bit later on. And then there are producers for the market, subdivided in independent producers, so the self-employed. And here the very rudimentary distinction has been made between free laborers and unfree laborers. So this is the first step, one could say. But at the same time, participants also really received this. This is only part of one table, a huge table, and there were 3 for each goal of the production. So household, redistributive, and market. They received also a big table more based on property relations. So this is really, really, really the echo of Marx. So who owns labor power? Who owns the labor project? So the thing that has been that's been worked on, the labor instruments and the output. And this is only a small part of one table. I can show you. You probably can't read it, but this is the rest of the table. And one of the first things that the discussant said during that meeting, look, this is all very nice, but this is already 15 labor relations. And really, I checked the notes from that first workshop. The first thing that was said, most people in history around the globe combined labor relations. So if these are already 15 types of labor relations, and if we allow for combinations of labor relations, we get a multitude of these very finely defined labor relations. And if you really want to make this applicable or usable and comparable worldwide, then you have to be less precise. And then a matrix form is better than this table. During this very first workshop discussion, as I said, the first remark was most people combine labor relations. A question was, okay, what are we looking at what level? If people do distributive work, do they work for the village? Do they work for the state? Why do we list children separately? What about women and women's work? And an important question, what exactly are property relations? I think it's also an interesting question for you. And very soon during the discussion, the answer was formulated, well, it's not really property relations as defined in laws, but it's more property relations based on power relations. So we left these huge tables aside, and we had many more workshops, plenary workshops, so with the whole group, but also with smaller groups of people who work on certain areas in the world to stimulate them to start working with us. So we had a nice project on the Lusophone world, so Portugal, but also the former Portuguese colonies, the Ottoman Empire, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and China. After all these discussions, this is the final taxonomy we came up with and we still work with. And what I would now like to do is talk you through this taxonomy. More the theoretical side of it, but while talking about it, I will also discuss with you how we made changes over time on this taxonomy based on the remarks our participant made. So if we start on the left side with the point of departure, we always start with the total population. So we always start our data gathering project with, let's say, demographics. So do we have estimations of or more exact data on the total population? we subdivide it by gender and age, and then we look at which part of this total population is not working because they cannot work or cannot be expected to work. So either people are too young or too old, or they go to school or they study. So these people are not expected to work. Then there are the affluent, so the people that don't have to work and actually don't work. So they live off the rent of their property, basically. And for the late 19th and 20th century, we also have the category of the unemployed. And then if you look at the, let's say, orange blocks, the orange blocks, so the next column is type of exchange. And the third column is goal of production. And if we look at the second column, so this type of exchange, so reciprocal labor, tributary labor, commodified labor, the theoretical background behind these three categories is really partially based on the work by 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗹 𝗛𝗂𝘀. In 1944, this economic historian, political economist, anthropologist, what was he not? 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗹 published The Great Transformation, in which he analyzed the development of modern states and market economies. And in his view, following industrialization, economic relations were no longer embedded in their local social relationships, their cultural values and moral concerns, as had been in the pre-industrial societies, in which production and distribution of goods was ensured first via reciprocity. So there's a mutual exchange of goods and services through kinship networks. So no markets there, people exchange goods and services based on their kinship networks. Then the next step in his setup was redistribution, what we call tributary labor. This is the idea that there is a central authority that people work for, produce for, and this central authority then redistributes the goods and the services. In his first works, he also talks about householding, in which production was based on households for self-consumption. In later work, this householding disappeared more or less, and we opted for the combination of householding and reciprocal labor. And we stated, okay, we look at reciprocal labor for the household. And then after industrialization, this one big regulating market was established according to Polanyi, in which prices controlled, regulated, and directed the economic system and thereby society. So if you look at this schema, you see it's no longer just property relations based on power relations, it's also about social relations. I also have to make a remark about some ideas of Polanyi that we didn't agree with, and a lot of scholars don't agree with. He seems to have this idea that there are stages in the developments of how societies are organized. So reciprocal exchange was dominant in what he calls primitive societies, so hunter-gatherer societies, while redistribution was characterized in ancient society, think Mesopotamia, and then market exchange was predominant in modern societies. As I said, this stages idea was criticized by various people, more recently by Jan Lucas in his The Story of Work, where he shows that labor market developed as early as the first millennium before the common era in Mesopotamia. And what we noticed very much is that reciprocal labor was and is still very much present in the world next to commodified labor. So we specifically don't see this orange, pink, and green bits as stages in a global development. We see it as separate types of exchange next to separate goals of production that can exist next to each other. I think that's an important statement to make. So if we take a close look at the orange bit, so it's reciprocal labor, people working for the household. Primarily, in our definition, we stated that in most societies, most households also produced a bit for the market. So let's say 80% that they produced was consumed by the household itself, but 20% was more likely always brought to the market and sold there. And then if you look at the labor relations of individuals, so the fourth column, you still see the idea of a hierarchy, implicitly in this case also still based on property relations based, power relations based property relations. So the leading producer is assumed to be the owner of the company, the owner of the household, the owner of the farm. So there's still some kind of hierarchy in it. So one is the leading producer. Then we have the kin producers, so spouses, children who work along with the leading producers. That can be kin non-producers, so the people that do reproductive work, that take care of the children, they take care of food supply for the people who produce. This is where, let's say, feminist criticism of Marxists philosophy was always stressing. So you can look at the producers, but if the producers, the wage workers go home, they still have to be fed and they are part of this bigger economic system. So this is the kin non-producers. And then there are the servants. Servants are non-kin in this case, not paid, so they're not the maid in the house. These are wage workers. So these servants are subordinate non-kin. And to give you already an example of how our participants of the Collaboratory had an impact on the making of this taxonomy, our colleagues working on sub-Saharan Africa, but also on other areas in the world, stressed these non-kin servants could often be slaves, or could often be unfree workers who were put into a household under pawnship conditions. So you are put in someone else's household to work there without remuneration to pay off a debt, for example. So here is an example of how our, let's say, initial taxonomy that we made was adapted by let's say the empirical experiences of specialists on other parts of the world. And then number 7 are the redistributive laborers working for households. We made households plural on purpose. This is to accommodate for people who work for village communities. So you could see a village community as a collection of households. For example, in the Indian Judge money system, here a village employs, let's say, the people that grow rice, the people that make clothes, the people that make shoes. Each of these village member has his or her own task, so they produce for the village, and the rice producers get their shoes from the shoemaker, and the shoemakers get the rice from the rice producers. Same kind of system also existed in Russia, the 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗹 system. I hope I pronounced that right. So this number 7 category was also added based on our colleagues working on India and Russia. So this is more or less the background of this reciprocal labor bit. And then there is the tributary labor bit that Polanyi called the distributive exchange. Here people have to work for what we called a polity, what Max Weber might have called an Anstalt. So it's an authority that is more or less accepted. And this authority could be the state ruler, the village ruler, the church, the monastery. People would have to work for such a polity in various degrees of unfreedom, and also for various periods of time that you see reflected here. And this polity would then redistribute the products or the services made by the workers. The obligatory laborers could be corvée laborers, for example. The indentured tributary labor could be people who had to work for the polity to pay off a debt. There are tributary serfs, for example, in Russia, the state serfs, they are bound to the soil. There are tributary slaves who are owned by and work for the polity. You could think of ancient Mesopotamia, but you could even think of present-day Ethiopia, where this system still exists. So this is more or less the explanation behind the tributary labor part, where people work for the polity. And then the green part is the commodified labor, where people work for the market, either directly or via non-market institutions like universities and schools, state offices. Here we have to say a bit more about commodified labor and what Marx thought about commodified labor. According to Marx, only wage work was commodified, only wage workers could sell their labor power, and only they were commodified according to Marx. Marcel van der Linden has in various publications questioned that. Why can only the possessors of labor power offer it for sale? Why cannot others do that? For example, slave owners who put their slaves for hire. Why can the possessors of labor power not sell their labor power along with their means of production? So if you are self-employed, you not only sell your labor power, but you sell your means of production at the same time, more or less. So he says, alongside so-called free wage laborers, there are also sharecroppers, self-employed artisans, subcontracted wage laborers who own their labor power. Only the latter do not sell it themselves. Others do that. And he says, in reality, labor commodification takes many different forms. Tom Brass, who published a lot about free and unfree labor, added that bonded, convict, contract, and indentured laborers were also forms of labor relations that were characterized by the sale of labor power on the labor market, in this case by other than the owners of the labor power. And more recently, historians Christian de Vito and Alex Lichtenstein also made a very elaborate and convincing argument to interpret various forms of convict labor as commodified. So within this category, we again have this household background for the self-employed people. We have the self-employed leading producers, say the shoemaker who owns his own workshop, the self-employed kin producers, let's say his spouse and his children who work along. We have the employers here, so people who employ 3 or more employees. There are the wage earners, there are the indentured laborers, like we had for the polity, the serfs and the slaves. And we have the wage earners who work for non-market institutions. And these are the labor relations individuals can have. To give you again an example of how we adapted our terms to based on the input of our colleagues who work on various parts of the world. In our earlier taxonomies, we always spoke about chattel slaves. And then our colleagues working on sub-Saharan Africa said, this is too reductionist. So there are various forms of slavery. And chattel slavery is the type of slavery that is most well known because it was transported to the north of the United States, but this is just one part of slavery. And of course, slavery studies nowadays has been far more advanced, and I think we are all very much aware of the various forms of slavery. But when we developed this taxonomy, this is not yet as common, as well known as it is today. So we turned chattel slavery into slavery and chattel slaves into slaves. And this household idea between 12a and 12b was very much given in by by our colleagues working on women's work. So often we use sources like censuses or tax records, and then only the head of the household is indicated, and then the head of the household is an artisan or a wage worker. But we know very little about what the rest of the household was doing. So people working on women's work in, for example, early modern Europe have developed systems to say, well, within these types of occupations, if the male heads of the households are artisans, then the women probably were working in his workshop as well, or they worked for themselves producing goods for others. So there are very many examples of male weavers whose spouses spin for them, but these spouses spin too much yarn just to be used by their male weaver partners, so they sell that product themselves. So it could very well be that within a household, both the head of the household and the spouse are both 12A, so to speak. So this is also an adaptation to the taxonomy that could be made. So where the first column is all about the total population, the second column is about the type of exchange, and the third column about the goal of the production. The fourth column is really about the labor relations of individuals, and individuals can be part of households, and then these households can be part of societies. And then the last column is a kind of extra column with extra characteristics. So people can be remunerated in different ways. So they can get a time rate like most of us today, but you could also be paid by piece. You could also be paid by getting part of the crops. It could also be arranged via cooperative subcontracting. So as a group, you get remuneration. Slaves could be working for the owner of the slave, but could also be rented out to others. So there could be slaves for hire. And we, as a kind of, let's say, ethical, moral addition, we also wanted to differentiate the employers in employers of free wage earners or unfree workers. So this is where this subcategory is based on. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions about this taxonomy. I'm happy to answer them later on, but this is the introduction as I thought it might be useful for now. Then we, as the project proceeded, I think the first two workshops really were dedicated to, on the one hand, having theoretical discussions about the taxonomy, but the good thing was at the same time we asked people to start gathering data, or at least make an inventory of the sources that could be used and give a rudimentary overview of the data that could be used. And then quite soon, I think in the first or second workshop, people said, okay, this taxonomy, fine, but could you send us a list of definitions of what you really mean by all these categories? So we started off with a light version of these definitions. And then during the workshops, these definitions were adapted, examples were added. And this working on the set of definition really was done in a dynamic way. So people started actually collecting data, came across difficulties, so where to put this and how to interpret that. So we started also to have discussions based on the practical data work. And since you are interested in also what terms to use and how to interpret terms and how to make taxonomies, we, for example, also had a very fundamental discussion on how to interpret the word peasant and translation of the word peasant in various sources. What is the difference between a peasant and a farmer? What's in which context is a peasant really never ever the owner of the plot of land he works on, and in which context he could perhaps be something in between the owner and the renter of the land. So here again, property relations did play a role every now and then. So our list of definitions was also more or less developed in the same way as the taxonomy. So we made a basic proposal, we discussed it, we adapted it, and of course we did not include all the remarks participants made, because all participants always started every presentation that, yes, okay, fine, but in my area things are different. So and then you quietly hear them out and think, okay, yeah, so this is really different, but seen from the moon, this is very much same as the labor relation in another country at another time. So it's a kind of balance. Yes. So then what are the kind of data that we collect? Well, we have to know the total population. Can be in a country, and of course country, nation is very much a late 19th century concept. So we often ended up with regions, and if it's regions with changing boundaries, let's say Russia, our colleague Gijs Kessler had made a very nice slideshow that showed the size of Russia during these 5 cross sections. So it grew and diminished and grew and diminished. So then we asked people to select a region within a wider area and collect data on that specific region and define that region very well. One could even follow a city over time, like Venice. We asked for the total population divided by gender and age, because we so very much wanted to include women's work and child labor. We asked people to indicate whether the area they collected data about was urbanized or not. Very often occupations are mentioned in the sources. Then we asked people to enter the occupation, and if it was there, the economic branch, as it was stated in the source, but also in the historical classification of occupations, HISCO. And then we asked people to interpret that data and add labor relations. And we stressed from the very first workshop, combinations of labor relations are possible and are significant. So if you think people had more than one labor relation, please add that to the database. So there are actually, to show you a bit how it works in practice, there are actually 3 columns for labor relations. And if you know a lot about the working situation of people, you can even say, okay, people worked for 30% of their time as a wage worker and 70% of the time as self-employed worker. So these combinations are relevant. And over time, we became a bit more tolerant. If you find a shoemaker in the sources, then is this shoemaker a wage worker who works for somebody else, or perhaps an apprentice, or the owner of a workshop, or maybe even an employer of 3 or more employees? If there are really no other sources that can give you information about that, we say to people, well, you can also say it's either 12 or 13 or 14. It's not as precise, but we still know it's commodified labor. Our colleagues use all kinds of sources, censuses, so population censuses, occupational censuses, tax records, which often go back in time for a long time, guild records. For the year 2000, we use data from 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗹, this big data center in Minnesota that collects censuses worldwide. For Africa, we even used archaeology. We had a very nice workshop with archaeologists working on Africa. I'll say a bit more about that. So people use various methods. So people make estimations, guesstimations, extrapolation. So you know something about a small area that is more or less representative for a broader area for your region, then you can extrapolate. You can also do back projections if you know, for example, that the sex ratio was more or less unchanged over time. You can back project a modern sex ratio to previous cross sections. For this 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗹 data, 2 colleagues of ours, Richard Seideman and Robert Stapel, actually wrote algorithm to assign labor relations based on the various characteristics of individuals. Also an interesting experiment. The archaeologists interpret findings. For example, they find bits and pieces of pottery with different decorations, so they know this has been produced in different areas. So some kind of trade or exchange must have been taken place. From excavations, they know that some houses had ovens next to it that were used to for the work of smith, so blacksmith. And often these houses together formed a kind of village, and that there used to be one oven, so that would be the oven of the blacksmith or the village. Of course, all very rudimentary, but something could be said about labor relations there as well. And when we first started this project, people said, well, we have to make footnotes to our data sets. But soon the idea developed, no, you should not make footnotes to your data set. And we very much looked at the Slavery Voyages database made by 𝗍𝗿𝗪 and later so many others, where they have really great methodological papers in which they explain how they made their calculations and estimations. So we asked people not only to make data sets, but also to write methodological papers explaining the sources you used, how you made your calculations, where you based your interpretations on, etc., etc. To give you some example of the sources our colleagues use, this is an 𝗍𝗿𝗴𝗶, an Ottoman tax register from 1845. This is one on Salonika. So each line includes data on income yielding activities of a household. This is a record of a guild of man working for workshops working for the military, or in this case, the Navy. And here you actually see the size of these workshops. So per workshop, you see the names of the men who worked there and their ages, which is a good micro history source for at least getting a grasp of the size of the workshop and the age of the workers there. This is the IPEMS source that I mentioned. So IPEMS International is a very good source for modern censuses, and they have a really great, they developed a really great method to, let's say, enable the visitors of the site to use the data and the records within the data in a more or less uniform way. This is an aerial picture of a village where archaeologists can read a lot in. So just to give you some examples of sources, and all the data sets that have been made so far, as well as the instructions, the model data set, the database that everybody used, can be found on the Dataverse of the International Institute of Social History. So here all the open access data is collected, and our data is collected in this History of Labor Relations Dataverse, sub-Dataverse. So here you see a brief explanation of the project and also a list of publications based on the project. Here you can also see all the data sets that have been added per region, per cross-section. And if you would click on the link, you would just have to enter your name and your affiliation and the purpose. Why do you want to use the data? And you can download it, and you download the data set automatically with the methodological paper. So researchers can still choose not to read the methodological paper and do all kinds of calculations with the data that are perhaps not always as reliable as could be if you read the methodological paper very well. But that's then the responsibility of the researchers. We provide them with all the background and all the, let's say, insecurities of the data. And then it's up to them to, let's say, weight that and use the data. And as I said, all these data are open access and can be downloaded. To give you some idea of how far we are now with data collectioning, these maps are made in 2018, but for 1500, it's really difficult. So I think this is still the state of the art today. Same goes for 1650. For 1800, we have more data sets than mentioned here. We have them for England now and for France, for the Indonesian archipelago. Same goes for 1900, also more data than we have here indicated. 1950 is specifically Sub-Saharan Africa. 2000 is very well covered because of these EPIMS data. To give you, this is not really what this talk is about. This is all about the taxonomy, but to give you some idea of what the outcome is. This is the world subdivided by the major primary labor relations. So we see in 1500, there's a lot of reciprocal labor. In 2000, there is far less reciprocal labor. You see for a long time, the non-working population increase, and this still continues in 1950 and 2000, but here we have the problem of the algorithm that has a hard time making a distinction between people who work for the household and people who are unemployed. So there the data on non-working is wobbly. You see commodified labor increase, but you don't see any, let's say, fine-grained developments in free and unfree labor here. Just to give you an idea how important secondary labor relations are, this is the development in Europe from 1800 to 2000, and then if you compare it to Europe without Russia, Russia is of course one of the areas we have good data on, and in Russia serfdom for a long time still existed, so Russia has a heavy weight in this European data. So we also made a graph without Russia, and then the picture looks different. And if you then focus on Russia and you see the difference between primary and secondary labor relations, you see a lot of household producers, household kin producers in the primary labor relations. But then if you look at the secondary labor relations, you see that many of them also had to do tributary labor. So it's always good to look at these various labor relations at the same time. These are some of the publications based on the data sets and the project. These are all open access. Unfortunately, there's still some publications not in open access. And the latest work based on the taxonomy, based on these primary labor relations, so reciprocal, tributary, commodified, is of course the book by Jan Lucassen, The Story of Work, A New History of Humankind. He really starts with the hunter-gatherers and ends with the precarious workers today. It's a very nice book. I would advise you to read it. It's easy to read. Received a lot of media attention, and interestingly enough, he's also interviewed by management schools, because he also writes a lot about how do people perceive their work, how do they value their work, what does work mean for their identity. Is a bit of a difficult word, but what is the meaning of work for them in their lives? And managers nowadays, with these shortages on the labor market, really want to know how their workers look upon their work and how they evaluate the various aspects of their work. So they're really interested in that. Next to that is the latest work by Marcel van der Linden, a World Wide Web of Work, open access publication in our new series with University College London Press. This is really a Marcel van der Linden book, so very conceptual, chapters on what is exactly the working class nowadays. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a very nice discussion between the two. So what is, in the end, what did global labor history bring us? What did the taxonomy bring us? Do we have to use a concept like capitalism or class, or can we do without? We recorded this discussion between the two of them, and you can have a look at it on YouTube. I think this wraps up really nice what we have been doing the last 25 years, not just the taxonomy and the project Global Collaboratory on the history of labor relations, but the Global Labor History Program in the broadest sense of the word. And the discussion also mentions, of course, what didn't we do yet and what should we do in the future. So I think I would like to leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Karin.